2025, and it might be time for the yoke to go. Let's talk about it. Let's get ready to rumble! Finally, I am back in the dive lab. It's been a long week, but today's video, we're going to talk about yoke versus DIN, because if you're a new diver looking to buy your first reg set, I just don't want you to make the same mistake that I did back in the day. I'm going to cover everything from the history, the cost, safety, compatibility, ease of use, all the technical specs, side-by-side comparison, so that you can make your own informed decision. But in order to do that, we have to go way back to 1946 to see where it all began. I'm Diver Dave. I've still got the coffee. Let's go. Now that we've made it back to 1946, we have to go back a few more years to 1943 to talk about a very important prototype from two inventors, Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnon, and their Aqualung or CG45, which was the first twin hose, open circuit, scuba regulator that had a way of attaching to a high pressure tank using a A-style clamp, kind of similar to this, but less standardized, more rudimentary, and a little bit more reminiscent of gas fittings from the commercial side of that era. Let's take a minute to have a look at what a yoke first stage and a yoke valve looks like, but first, I gotta switch over to the close-up cam. Let's take a minute to talk about the yoke valve. And this is a pretty standard yoke valve that I have sitting in my spare parts drawer because I no longer use it. It's a pretty standard valve. Most of the times, valves will have their working pressure stamped on them somewhere, although this one does not appear to have that. But I'll take a guess because it's a yoke valve that'll be somewhere in the 200 to 232 bar range. Because it's a yoke valve, the O-ring is actually sitting in a groove inside the valve head, as opposed to a DIN where the actual O-ring sits inside the first stage. On the back of the valve, you'll notice that there is a dimple that marries up with the pin on the yoke first stage, and we'll show that here in a sec. And last but not least, you'll notice that the O-ring itself sits quite forward inside the head valve, and I've kind of pictured that here in terms of the dotted line. And again, we'll talk about that in a sec as we start to get the two mated together. So that's a pretty quick coverage of what a yoke valve looks like. Now let's take a look at the yoke first stage, which happens to also be sitting in my spare parts drawer. This is a very nice Apex XTX 200 yoke style first stage. And as you can see here, like we talked about on the back of the valve, there is the pin on the first stage that marries up with the dimple on the back of the valve head to create a secure connection. The other thing to keep in mind is that this lip here is actually what presses against the yoke O-ring inside the valve head, creating that secure airtight connection. So as we start to clamp down, that pushes against the O-ring and creates that tight connection. And you can take a look on this one and you'll see that this is actually stamped with the working pressure of 232 bar. A quick warning that we are going to be jumping between bar and PSI throughout the video, but don't be afraid because somewhere I'm going to actually include a cheat sheet that allows you to convert bar to PSI very easily. So keep watching. And I want to get into working pressures of the yoke as it's progressed over the years because it is a little bit of a gray area to me. But for now, we'll just go with the fact that this is stamped at 232 bar, which is roughly 3,400 PSI. Now let's take a minute to marry up the yoke first stage to the yoke valve. So we simply hand tighten to make sure the pin is sitting inside the dimple. And now that lip is starting to create that O-ring seal. And this is a hand tight action only. And now we have a nice sort of connection between the first stage and the yoke valve. And you'll still notice, because of where the O-ring sits inside the valve head, it is quite forward in terms of this entire connection. So what does that really mean? Well, there's a few things. Number one is the max working pressure of the yoke. If we go with the highest number out there is 232, which is about 3,400 PSI. If we go with any more pressure than that, there is a chance that we actually dislodge or have the O-ring start to extrude out, which is bad news. The other thing to think about is because of the style and the design of this, if you're in an overhead environment and you bang one side or the other under high working pressure, there is also the risk that you cause the O-ring to become loose or extrude out again. So again, bad news. Also, you can take a look and see that the profile, the length, is actually quite long in terms of overall length here. So in terms of clearance, this could be an issue. And last but not least is the weight. Typically, because of all the machining and the extra parts, a yoke setup with a yoke valve and a yoke first stage obviously is going to weigh a little bit more because of all the extra material. Let's take a minute to talk about max working pressures for the yoke style design, because this is where, for me, it gets a little bit gray. So back in the 50s when the Aqualung came out, their yoke style adapter, which was, remember, refined by US divers to reflect what we have now today, was rated at 2,900 PSI, which kind of makes sense because the low pressure steel tanks they would have been using would most likely have been somewhere in the 2,400 to 2,600 PSI range. So to have a yoke style clamp max rated to 2,900 makes sense. But something happens over the next 30 years, and it was hard to find the answers in terms of the why. But now we came out with yoke style clamps because the O-ring design didn't change. But now these clamps are coming out stamped with 2,900 PSI, 3,200 PSI, 3,340 PSI, 3,400 PSI, and then at the end, 3,480 PSI. And it's kind of perplexing to me as to what changed so in order that they could bump the range up. Now, I'm sure we have a few experts watching this, or at least I hope so. And if you guys know, please take the time, reach out, or put some comments. I'd love to hear why. One of the theories that I've seen online in a few places is that late 80s to early 90s, high-pressure steel tanks started to evolve. And they were originally coming out with a 3,500 PSI working pressure. But, of course, that would have been above the yoke-style max working pressure. And so what did they do? It sounds like they actually dropped the max working pressure of the steel tanks to 3,442 to just get it within the limits of a yoke-style connection, which is pretty interesting and kind of makes sense because most of North America at that time were not using DIN, and so they would have been completely fitted with yoke-style connections, first stages, valves, and so this would have been a massive retrofit to a technology that most people were not even aware of. So I think that theory does make sense. And that would lead me back to my original question, which is, well, what is the exact working pressure of a yoke connector? Is it the 200 bar that it originally started with in the 50s? Or is it the 232 or 240 bar max rating that it ended up with today? I just don't know. So it's a great question, and I would love to hear some comments on that one. The yoke recap. In 1943, they had a prototype. In 1945, they had a patent. In 1946, they released the first version of the Aqualung, or the CG45, and then in the 1950s, with a distributor deal with US divers, they redesigned the yoke style connection to what it is today. We've done a quick overview of how it all works, and now we get to flip the switch and turn it over to discuss DIN. One of the things that I love about making these videos is that I also get the opportunity to learn while I'm doing the research. And when it comes to DIN, the waters are actually pretty murky in terms of who actually owns the invention. What I do know is that it started its life off as a 5/8 threaded connection, and the first scuba company to actually incorporate it was Poseidon, based out of Sweden, while they were trying to introduce their products into the US market. At the time, the uptake on the DIN style connector was not really well received. This would have been back in the late 1950s, and all of their literature at the time would have actually referenced to a 5/8 threaded connection. There was no talk about DIN. So where did the acronym DIN come from? It's a great question, and in 1956, the German standards organization, Deutsche Institut für Normung, reviewed the 5/8 threaded connection and approved it as a standardized high-pressure fitting for all industrial gas cylinders. And that eventually worked itself into a DIN scuba standard called DIN 477, which broke down into two areas: DIN 232 bar, which was a 5-threaded connection, and also DIN 300 bar, which was a 7-threaded connection. And then over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, started to proliferate across Europe because it was sort of looked at by technical divers who were diving a lot in cold water as a more secure and robust way of making that connection to the high-pressure cylinder. Let's head on back to the close-up cam to take a look at a DIN first stage and also a DIN valve. And did you notice? I didn't even look at that to pick them up. That's just well-rehearsed or just pure raw talent. This is a very nice XS Scuba DIN valve. And you can see that the XS Scuba is marked on the back. It comes with a very nice visual aid in terms of showing when the valve is fully open versus fully closed. You'll notice that it actually is stamped with 3442 PSI on the front, indicating that it is a high pressure valve. And you can see all of the threads inside where the first stage will marry up to. More importantly, notice that on this valve, there is no O-ring to worry about. So that is a big difference between yoke and DIN. With yoke, the O-ring is on every valve, which means it's on every tank. And with DIN, it just means there's one O-ring, and that is actually sitting on the first stage DIN connector. And we'll take a look at that in a sec. You can also notice that we still have the dimple on the back, and we can talk about why in a bit. And most importantly, you can see that the O-ring is now actually sitting at the back of the valve head as opposed to the front of the valve head on a yoke valve. So now that it's sitting on the back, it means that this is capable of working at a much higher pressure. In fact, 300 bar, which is about 4350 PSI, because the O-ring is actually encapsulated from the first stage and also the back of the valve head. So the risk of an O-ring extrusion is very minimal compared to yoke. So overall, that's a very quick overview of what a DIN valve looks like. Now let's take a look at the first stage. We have a very nice Apex DS1 DIN first stage here, which has also been sitting in my spare parts drawer. You'll notice that the big difference is now the O-ring is sitting inside a groove on the first stage itself. So huge advantage over yoke, because now I only have to worry about this O-ring versus an O-ring on every yoke tank valve. There is a collar that allows you to easily thread this in and mate it up to the valve head of the DIN valve. And as you can see, most of this is what gets threaded into the valve, which pushes the O-ring to the back of the valve. So that O-ring is completely encapsulated by the two pieces of metal, which really reduces the risk of an O-ring extrusion. So based on the fact that this is a much more secure connection and the fact that there's that O-ring encapsulation, the working pressure is much higher for a DIN type connection, and they put this at 300 bar or 4350 PSI. So overall, much more secure and robust connection using the DIN setup. Now that we've taken a look at both of the pieces, let's get them connected and we'll take a look. So it's a pretty simple threading process to get this in, and you could make the argument that the yoke connector is maybe slightly easier to get connected. There is no threading required. And again, hand tight, because really that high pressure is really what's going to make that O-ring sort of seal. And now you can see, based on our previous video of the yoke, that the length between the two is actually a whole lot less than the yoke is. We can also see that that O-ring is really at the back of that valve head, making that more secure, robust connection. So overall, it's lighter, it's more robust, there's less risk of an O-ring extrusion. So in my mind, just from a technical perspective, the DIN connector wins. Let's get back to fun fact number one. And in 1946, a mast, snorkel, and fin set cost right around $15. That's a pretty big difference to today's prices, which would be somewhere in the $400 to $500 range for a good set. You know, Dave, I'm hearing what you're saying about the DIN. It sounds pretty good. But I'm also hearing the horror stories about all these places down south that do not support DIN, and then I'm going to go down there with my DIN regulator and I'm going to be stuck. Well, I get it. I've heard the same stories. I've only been down south twice, and on each occasion, I never had an issue getting a DIN style tank. But just in case, there is an option to make sure that you are covered. There is a handy DIN to yoke adapter that will convert this into a yoke style connection. So let's take a look. Pretty simple. I can just connect this in. That's threaded. And now I have a first stage that is DIN, but looks like an A-clamp. And then if I just take my yoke valve and connect that in, now you can see I am fully compatible, even though I have a DIN first stage. So this adapter would be very handy to have in the toolbox if you think you're going to be doing a lot of down south diving. We have one more scenario that we should talk about. I have a DIN type valve, and my buddy wants to borrow my tank, but unfortunately he has a yoke style first stage. Well, we know that it is not compatible, but the good news is there is a DIN to yoke adapter that I can thread into the DIN valve. So we simply can thread that in, and we will tighten it up. And now I can take my yoke adapter, and now I have a yoke first stage sitting on a DIN valve using that DIN to yoke adapter. It becomes very easy to translate it back to a yoke style connection, but the opposite is actually not true. So this really makes the case that DIN really is more flexible and more compatible over yoke. Dave, I just bought my first yoke reg set, and now you come out with this video? Don't worry, I've got you covered. Because just like I said earlier in the video, I also made the same mistake back in the day as a new diver. I had no idea that DIN even existed, and I was so excited to buy my first reg set, which was an MK25 Evo from Scuba Pro. And I bought it at Canada Diving Supply, by the way. But it started its life off as a yoke, and I actually had it converted over to DIN. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is I'm not sure if all sort of reg sets can be converted from yoke to DIN, so something you'd have to ask your local dive shop about. And as a bonus, if you actually keep the yoke hardware after the conversion is done, like I did here, you could have your dive shop converted back from DIN to yoke if you were traveling down south and had some worries about compatibility. So just something to keep in mind. See, I told you I had you covered. Now that we've had a chance to take a look at yoke and DIN up close, let's have a look at the technical scorecard. Okay, it is almost a guarantee that at some point you're going to buddy up with a diver on a shore dive or the charter boat. You're going to want to talk about dive plans and turn pressures, and you are going to talk PSI, and they are going to come back at you in bar. And then it's going to come to a crashing halt. Trust me, I know. But there's a pretty easy conversion. Technically, 1 bar is equal to 14.5 PSI, but let's round that up to 15. So 1 bar equals 15 PSI, 100 bar equals 1500 PSI, 200 bar equals 3000 PSI. And if you want to break it into rule of thirds and keep that last third as your safety buffer at 700 PSI, then that is going to be approximately 50 bar. That's the cheat sheet. It should make it easy to talk bar and PSI with your buddy. By now, I hope that you're starting to see that DIN is the superior technology if you're thinking about buying your own reg set. But if that's the case, then why is yoke still so popular in North America? Let's be honest, it's been around since the 50s. Rental shops, dive shops, resorts have a massive investment of, yoke tanks and yoke valves and yoke rental sets. So for them to really turn that all over to DIN is most likely cost prohibitive. But it doesn't mean that just because you learned or rented a yoke reg set, that is the best choice when it comes time for you to purchase one. So hopefully all of the information we kind of shared here today will help in that decision. I firmly believe, and based on my own personal experience, that DIN is the better way to go right off the bat. You are future-proofing yourself and saving any conversion costs down the road. DIN, as we've seen, is the better technology. It's more robust and more secure. And just like that, we have come to the end of another 613 dive video. It's been a fun one to learn. I know I learned a ton as well. And like I always say, if you feel like the content has delivered, please take a minute, hit the like, throw me a few comments, hit the subscribe button. This is the way the 613 Dive YouTube channel is going to continue to grow. And last but not least, practice hard, dive safe. Take care. An important, I keep sticking on the important of that era. A twin hose open circuit scuba regulator. Now that we've made it back in, and their design of the, it's a lot of taking. Let's take a minute to take a look. How much taking are we doing? You should future-proof the close-up clam. No, the close-up cam. I mean, how many times did I practice that? I'm just freaking dying here with the hoses. Jesus Christ. Get it together. All you got to do is just get it together.